Hello students! We're starting a brand new unit focusing on the African American Civil Rights Movement. Over the next 3 weeks, we will be talking about the Southern Civil Rights Movement and then transitioning to the Northern Civil Rights Movement. We will be dividing the unit into 5 parts. The first part that we'll be focusing on is Brown v. Board of Education. Over the next 3 weeks, we will talk about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panther Party. Make sure you have your worksheet for this video with you. There may or may not be a quiz tomorrow on the information you will see. So, to start the discussion of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, we must first provide background information on the historical struggle for civil rights. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was an order issued by then-President Abraham Lincoln. In order to entice Southern slaves to join the Union forces, Lincoln, quote, freed the slaves in the Confederate States of America, a government that he had no political control over.
On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation after issuing a draft back in September 1862. In the final draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln stated all slaves are and henceforward shall be free. However, in actuality, the emancipation was very limited in its ability to secure enslaved individuals' freedom.
It does 2 things. It frees slaves in the states and parts of states that are in rebellion against the Union. So that means it doesn't free those slaves in the border states or those people who are enslaved in the parts of states that are under Union control. So that leaves 800,000 people still in bondage. The other thing about the Emancipation Proclamation that a lot of people don't realize is that for the first time, it formally authorizes the enlistment of black soldiers. They hadn't been authorized to enlist formally until the Emancipation Proclamation. So it does those 2 things. It frees the slaves in parts of states that are still rebelling against the United States, and it authorizes the enlistment of black soldiers.
Thus, one critique of Lincoln's proclamation is that it was only given out of military necessity. On January 2nd, the proclamation was printed in newspapers throughout the South, and despite its limitations, it was significant because it sent a message both to enslaved individuals in the Confederacy that enslavement would no longer be tolerated in the United States.
Slavery wasn't officially outlawed in the United States until several years later. With the Union victory and the conclusion of the Civil War, the United States passed a series of politically charged laws that would eventually become a permanent fixture to our Constitution. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments bestowed upon the newly freed slaves a sense of civil rights not all of them had fully experienced. The 13th Amendment, passed by Congress on January 31, 1865, and ratified by the states on December 6, 1865, states, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction, unquote. It was this amendment that the United States officially abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, added to the Constitution in July 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including the former slaves and recently free. With the passage of this amendment, African Americans were no longer viewed as 3/5 of a person under the law. They were, in fact, full-fledged U.S. citizens with the rights outlined by Thomas Jefferson nearly a century earlier, the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Finally, the last sweeping amendment of the Reconstruction era involved granting African American men the right to vote. The 15th Amendment, added to the Constitution in February 1870, guaranteed freed men the right to cast their vote in elections. Things were seemingly good for African Americans during the so-called Reconstruction era. Along with 3 amendments, the United States was trying to pick up the pieces of the Civil War and improve lives of the newly freed slaves. African Americans were soon allowed to vote, seek political office, purchase their own land, and find their own jobs. However, there was severe backlash, particularly in the former Confederate States of America. Black codes were becoming increasingly popular. Starting in the Midwest, black codes were designed to prevent a dramatic increase of newly freed slaves from coming into traditional northern states. Black codes soon evolved and migrated south as many attempted to reestablish the old Southern order. Jim Crow laws, creating a racial caste system in the South, was a means to keep African Americans in an inferior position. Named after a black character in minstrel shows, Jim Crow laws were designed to keep blacks and whites separate. This included restaurants, public restrooms, transportation, and education. The Civil War had been fought in part to eliminate the inferior positions of African Americans. Much of the country was still actively absorbed in the social aspects of putting African Americans in their place. Testing out the Jim Crow laws, a man by the name of Homer Plessy, a mixed-race man, seated himself in the white compartment of a train in Louisiana in 1892. After he was challenged by the conductor, Plessy was arrested and charged with violating the state law, which happened to be based heavily on the social order of Jim Crow. He was found guilty by Judge John H. Ferguson. Using Plessy's conviction as a means to challenge Jim Crow in the nation's highest court, Plessy versus Ferguson was heard before the Supreme Court.
By 1877, Reconstruction had succumbed to bitter opposition and backroom politics. Federal troops then occupying the South were withdrawn, and white supremacists were left to reestablish the racial hierarchy that had existed before the war. Across the former Confederacy, informal practices of racial discrimination were written into law. States instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, and other requirements that disenfranchised Negroes. They passed Jim Crow laws, which imposed segregation and other restrictions on blacks. A few blacks challenged the system of legal discrimination. In New Orleans, a man named Homer Plessy deliberately defied the Louisiana state law requiring separate rail cars for blacks and whites. He was arrested and jailed. But the incident led eventually to the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy argued that the law infringed on his 14th Amendment right to equal protection. But the majority of justices disagreed. The court's opinion read in part,
"Legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane."
The court affirmed that segregation was constitutional as long as accommodations were separate but equal. It also left it up to the individual states, not the federal government, to guarantee equal standards. As the lone dissenting opinion, Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote,
"The thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done."
Plessy versus Ferguson became a landmark decision. It sanctioned a system of institutionalized racism that would persist for decades, one that would require a second period of Reconstruction to overcome.
So what were the ramifications of Plessy versus Ferguson? As the clip showed, institutionalized racism became the norm. Signs indicating blacks only and no colored people allowed were seen all over. Separate but equal became the norm. Separate but equal. But was separate truly equal? For many blacks, separate meant anything but equal. Black schools were found to be inferior to white schools in many ways. The quality of education, the distance many students had to walk, and the rundown conditions of many schools all took a toll on educating the African American population. In the fall of 1950, members of the Topeka, Kansas chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, agreed to challenge the separate but equal doctrine in public education. NAACP members thought of a plan to test the doctrine imposed by Plessy by calling on parents to enroll their children in white schools. 13 parents agreed. Each parent waited for enrollment dates for their local schools and attempted to enroll their students. When they were denied, they were to report back to the NAACP. The chapter's lawyers were preparing litigation to take before the courts in a lawsuit against the Topeka School Board. February 28, 1951. The NAACP legal team, under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, filed suit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. While the district court ruled in favor of the school board, members of the African American community appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Combining the Topeka case with cases from Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., the Brown case was heard before the court. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision that separate but equal was unconstitutional, violating the 14th Amendment. There was no reason other than race that children were forced to attend different schools.
By the early 50s, segregation was frayed by the war and torn in spots where the court had acted. The white primary was outlawed. Housing covenants outlawed. Some graduate and law schools were forced to admit blacks. But the court was aware that the big fight was still to come. The schools, K through 12, white children and black in the same classroom.
Southerners assumed that if grade school kids were in a desegregated setting, they'd get to know each other and they'd get to date each other and then they'd marry each other. And that was the strongest taboo that the South held.
Led by Thurgood Marshall and other young lawyers like Robert Carter, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was running or aiding cases all over the country. The court picked 5 and consolidated them into one set of arguments, forever known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. As oral arguments approached, people camped outside the building to assure themselves a seat in the courtroom. NAACP lawyers Marshall and Carter were up against a formidable adversary, John W. Davis, a former presidential candidate making the last of his 140 appearances at the Supreme Court. But his arguments had a familiar ring. Separate wasn't necessarily unequal. Blacks should be happy with the way things were. Didn't states have the right to educate their children as they saw fit? When the 3 days of arguments were over, Davis was heard to remark, "I think we've got it won, 5-4, or maybe 6-3. The justices scheduled another hearing on the case. But before that could happen, Chief Justice Vincent died of a heart attack. President Eisenhower chose to nominate Earl Warren, formerly the governor of California. On May 17, 1954, there were signs. Some of the justices' wives showed up. Some clerks were tipped off. Then reporters rushed the courtroom.
Warren starts off in a bland manner, and you can't tell for a while as he's delivering the opinion what the outcome is going to be. And then he comes to the key line and he says, "And we unanimously hold that separate but equal has no place in the Constitution." And it was just electric in the courtroom when he said unanimous.
We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we unanimously hold that the plaintiffs are deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Plessy v. Ferguson in education is no more, and in practice, Plessy v. Ferguson itself is no more. The era of Jim Crow, constitutionally speaking, is over.
This was precisely what we urged them, almost in that language. So it was gratifying to have the opinion come down almost in the language of the argument that we made to them.
In 1951, I'd used a plain geometry book that had been used by a white student in 1935. Brown said that that was over. The hand-me-down tubas that I played in the high school band from the white high schools, it said to me that that was ended. And it said to me that at some point, I would not have to travel from Atlanta to Greencastle in Indiana to get an undergraduate degree. That my family, my cousins, my neighbors could go to Georgia Tech and to the University of Georgia. The Supreme Court decision of 1954 was for me the Magna Carta. It was the second emancipation. It was a great moment.
But even though the highest court in the nation had effectively outlawed Jim Crow in public education, there was still a long way to go. 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas.
Until 1954, segregation laws in some states forbade black students from attending the same schools as white students. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court outlawed segregation throughout the country and ordered that white-only schools must be open to African American students with all deliberate speed. The governor of the state of Arkansas vowed to defy the order. "Blood will run in the streets if Negro pupils should attempt to enter Central High School," he said. The school board of the city of Little Rock, Arkansas, planned otherwise. To comply with the Supreme Court order, the school board of the city of Little Rock announced that the city's all-white secondary school could now accept black students. On the first day of school in September 1957, 9 African American children, later referred to as the Little Rock Nine, planned to enroll in Little Rock Central High School. Elizabeth Eckford was one of the 9. The Little Rock School Board asked parents of the 9 students not to accompany their children to school because the board feared that the presence of African American parents would incite a mob. The governor of Arkansas sent the National Guard into Little Rock, claiming that there was a danger of violence. Arrangements were made for all 9 students to meet off campus and approach the school accompanied by a lawyer and under military protection. Because the Eckford family had no telephone, Elizabeth was unaware of the arrangements, so she set out alone. When she got off the bus near Central High School, Elizabeth saw a crowd of angry white people and hundreds of armed soldiers whom the governor had sent to prevent the 9 students from entering the school. Elizabeth thought she might be safe if she walked behind the Arkansas soldiers to the school entrance. Believing the guards were present to protect her, she tried to pass through the line several times before being forced back into the white crowd.
The crowd began to follow me, calling me names. All of a sudden, my knees began to shake, and I wondered whether I could make it. It was the longest block I ever walked in my whole life. Even so, I was not too scared, because I thought the guards would protect me. When I got in front of the school, I went up to a guard again, but he just looked straight ahead and did not move to let me pass. I did not know what to do. Just then, another guard let some white students through. When I tried to squeeze past him, he raised his bayonet. Somebody started yelling, "Lynch her! Lynch her!" I tried to see a friendly face. I made eye contact with an old woman, but she spat on me. I looked down the block and saw a bench at the bus stop. I ran to the bench and sat down.
Some of the crowd followed Elizabeth to the bench, shouting, "Drag her over to the tree," a way of saying they would lynch her. As Elizabeth sat on the bench for what seemed like an eternity, a white woman named Grace Lorch made her way through the crowd and spoke to Elizabeth. Elizabeth slowly lifted her eyes and looked up at the stranger. Then she got up. Walking close beside her, the woman guided her to a nearby bus stop. Elizabeth got on the bus and escaped from the mob. Over the next few weeks, the governor continued to fight federal authorities until finally on September 24, President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard control and ordered the 101st Airborne Division to escort the 9 students into the school. For the remainder of the school year, the Guard accompanied the students from class to class. The Little Rock Nine eventually succeeded in integrating Central High School. Elizabeth later received a degree in history from the Central State College in Wilberforce, Ohio. She served in the United States Army for several years and found employment as a social worker and substitute teacher. Elizabeth returned to Little Rock in 1974 to live in her family's home, the only one of the 9 to return to that city to live. In 1999, 42 years later after the crisis, Elizabeth and the other Little Rock Nine students received the Congressional Gold Medal from President Clinton as a permanent remembrance of their unforgettable moment of courage.
Had a dream at dawn and a trumpet had blown. Had a dream, dream that a dream.
3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, public education was still struggling to achieve the precedent set out in that landmark case. Please be prepared to talk about this in class tomorrow. Have a wonderful night.